thank you so much. And I hate to be the people between you and lunch, but I hope that it's a little bit interesting. So my name is Ngaire Blankenberg. Ignore the G in there. I describe myself as a museum doctor, in that I fix museums or help museums being born, maybe a museum midwife or a museum therapist. So essentially I help clients all over the world develop museums or their cultural resources for some kind of benefit. I think that many people often say to me, oh, museums are dying, and in the digital age, when we have Netflix, who needs to go to museums anymore? But the fact of the matter is, museums are not dying. 80,000 museums in the world and growing, and 50% of those that were built or extended in the last 40 years. So all kinds of people are turning to museums as a solution for something. Museums are built by national, regional, and city governments. They're built by different departments of government. This is, for example, a museum I worked on in Dhaka, Bangladesh, by the Navy. But it's also departments of arts and culture, departments of tourism, city governments, etc. The private sector is also building museums, private collections, and even civil society is building museums. This is the Red Cross Museum in Geneva, Switzerland. So people build museums for many reasons. I don't know if you've heard of the Museum of Broken Relationships in Zagreb. And so you have there the toaster of vindication. Let me just go back and tell you what it says. Oh no, I don't have that text. But basically this is a museum that collects all the remnants of broken relationships around the world. But the more formal reasons why people develop museums are preserve collections, celebrate heritage, appeal to national pride, attract tourists, remember the past, and also prepare for the future. So this picture here is a project I'm working on in Dubai called the Museum of the Future. And the whole idea of that is to get people to think of something called predictive design. It's to prepare people for the future through showing them what kind of movements, technologies will be happening in the future. So museums are not just about the past, they're also tools to prepare for the future. So everybody building these museums, I think in one way or another recognize that museums have soft power. They're able to influence and change behavior without paying people off or through military coercion or guidance. But I would say that many museums continue to operate in an outdated paradigm of soft power. And I think that we talk about soft power as a new development. The fact is, I mean, when Joseph Nye wrote his book, it was 20 years ago, and soft power has changed a lot. I think Dr. J here spoke a lot about some of the changes that are happening in soft power, and I think the Soft Power 30 Index is showing how soft power needs to change and also look at possibly less Eurocentric ways of evaluation. The fact is, museums are, in their core, an agent of hard power. They are formed from the spoils of colonialism and war. And this is a picture of the precursor of the V&A, actually, the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. Museums continue to be seen as representational symbols and a symbol of power, even if they come across as being different. This is another project I worked on. It's called the King Abdulaziz Center for World Culture in Saudi Arabia. It was paid for $1 billion by Saudi Aramco, the big oil company. And I think that the intent of certainly the King Abdulaziz Center for World Culture was not necessarily hard power as we know it, but it was a very complex exercise. Museums are seen as the voice of the 1%. This is a museum in Beirut, in Lebanon, a private museum, Tony Salame, who also runs a luxury shopping mall. And museums are also seen as a signifier of luxury. This is a Zaha Hadid building, it's a development, housing development in Miami called 1,000 Museums. And predictably, and I think rightfully, people are fighting back. People are not so interested in this old idea of museums. Museums are often in cities, in the most incredibly expensive land. They cost a hell of a lot of money to build, and they create gentrification in neighborhoods. This is the museum set up. We are the 99% against the 1%. This was against in the Occupy movement. This is here in India around the privatization of one of the art museums. And this is a recent protest outside MoMA in New York City. Shiny new buildings, shabby old wages. Because as much as we like to think of museums as being outside of the world somehow, beyond even nations, and they are actually physical bricks and mortar institutions that exist in our cities, that hire people, and that operate on an institutional basis. So I think the time for soft power, capital S, capital P of museums is over. We need to think of soft power a little bit differently. Soft power in the 21st century is not the same as soft power in the 20th century. And museums in the 21st century must speak a new language in order for them to have influence. So here's a little table. You can read through that quickly. I know we don't have a lot of time. But we've been talking a lot recently about national soft power. Quite frankly, I think that that era of soft power being held by nations is pretty much over. I wrote a book called Cities, Museums, and Soft Power because I think that soft power really sits in the translocal and I think in the urban. I think that people are not necessarily attracted to England. I think people can be attracted to London. I think that people associate Mumbai with certain things that are very different than what are associated with India. I think that New York has a completely different reputation, especially right now, than the United States of America. I think that earlier 20th century soft power was really governed by public diplomacy, I would say, strategic communications, and the idea of building reputations. I think we're moving a lot more into an era of building social capital. I think the tools of 21st century soft power are civil society more than their governments. I think they focus on participation, and I think they're different values. Rather than branding, I think we have social media, popular culture, we have festivals, mass media, we have events. I think soft power is evolving in the 21st century, and I think museums also need to evolve. So museums, like many other institutions, their soft power is actually based on trust. And there have been a number of studies around museums as being, in fact, more trusted institutions than almost everything else. More than universities, more than media, more than popular culture. They're, in fact, one of the most trusted cultural institutions, or, in fact, soft power bodies, that there is. And I think that that trust is something that we cannot take for granted. The trust in the 21st century has to be created in a very different way than in the 20th century. So I really advocate building trust through the 4 E's. And I think that if we look at how India could really support soft power, real soft power through its museums, these 4 E's might be important. The first is entrance. The second is experience. The third is empowerment. And the fourth is exchange. So when I talk about entrance, does anyone know what this is? So this is the Guggenheim Bilbao. So has anyone ever heard of the Bilbao effect? Yeah, so the Bilbao effect, it came about maybe about 15 years ago because it was this little industrial town in Spain where I live called Bilbao, and suddenly they got this big star architect, Frank Gehry, to come and make this big museum, and it transformed the entire economy of the city. And since then everyone's like, oh my God, if we want to have urban revitalization and if we want to change from an industrial economy to a tourist-based economy, we need to build a museum. What we've since found out is that, in fact, that is not that simple. What Bilbao did, which was very interesting, is that it created the museum as part of a major project that was really centered in developing the city. And so when I talk about entrance, and I use this example of Bilbao, I'm talking about museums needing to have a relationship to the urban infrastructure in which they exist. I think a lot of the time, especially when we have national museums, we think of national museums representing India. But the fact is, the National Museum exists in New Delhi. Thousands of people walk by it every day. It exists in a particular urban context, and it needs to be seen within the structure of that context. So entrance equals creating community, and it means about, enhancing livability. And I think it's really significant that a lot of new museum builds these days create a huge, big public space outside of the museum. Because when we think of urbanization and our cities, which is the biggest trend that's happening in the world, we have a problem with civic space. We have a problem with public space, but we also have a problem with civic space. I think Civicus director called it a global emergency on public space. Museums create around them a lot of public space that needs to be protected and preserved because we're fast losing it, especially in a city as dense as New Delhi. So this image here I think is really interesting because Vienna topped the Economist Intelligence Unit's 2018 rankings of the world's most livable cities. And this is a picture from the museum quarter in Vienna. And what it's created is, in fact, a free, open, public space in the heart of Vienna that's really effective. And I think it's effective because it's free and because, though, it's connected with culture. But sometimes this is not enough. I live in Barcelona, and there's a beautiful museum there called the Museum MACBA, a contemporary art museum, and it was created a big museum. It's fantastic, it's amazing, and there's a huge public space outside it, and everyone there goes to skateboard, and nobody goes inside the museum. Here's a picture of actually a Bangladeshi festival that happened a couple months ago, and nobody went in the museum. I went inside, there were like 5 people inside. And so that is also why entrance is extremely important, because it's not about connecting just a physical connection or a public space with your cities. It's also about being free, accessible, and open. A lot of the times we have security guards in the perimeter around the museum, and we charge a prohibitive entrance fee, and we say, you know what, you're not really allowed to come in here. There's a term called the museum threshold. And across that threshold, a lot of people don't come. If you're not highly educated, if you're not typically well off, if you're not white in the West, generally you don't think of museums as places for you. And that's why I say entrance, the entrance experience is one of the most critical experiences for creating soft power of the museum. The next D is experience. I mean, museums can be wonderful places and collections are extremely important, but they're also places of imagination and a connection between the past, the present, and the future. And this is where I think exhibition design is very important. And I think in my experience in Indian museums, it's an area it's often sacrificed. So there's all this investment in the collection, and of course there's a big, massive investment in the building, but the experience, the budget for the actual design is very, very small. So this is an exhibition that I did working with a design company, Kosman de Young, in the Jewish Museum in Berlin, called Jerusalem. And this is an experience. It uses all their collections, a collection-based museum, but creates a kind of imagination. This is the visitor center for the Parliamentary Museum for the European Union in Brussels. And again, you can see the power of design to bring ideas to life. Experience is about imagination. And this is another project that I'm working on, which is a football museum. See, everybody makes museums. So I don't know if anyone's a fan of the Olympique de Marseille football museum. I live in Barcelona, so obviously I'm all about Barca, but I could put it aside to talk about OM. But the point is about OM is that they're wanting to create a hub for a football club that is firmly connected to the city of Marseille, but also provides a completely different experience of what football is all about. And this is one of our ideas of bridging together the brand of Marseille and the brand of the Olympique de Marseille. Another very important aspect of experience is visitor services. We need to be nice to people in museums. This is a project that I worked on for many, many years. It's the National Museum of African American History and Culture, one of the newest Smithsonians that opened in DC. And I'm very proud of that museum, and I'll return to it in a sec. But one of the key things about it is visitor services. You know, museums, again, I tell you time and time again, we put all our money into the building and into the collection, and we put no money into the people in the museums, and we put no money into the design or the lighting, and those are where the soft power of museums lie. Empowerment of visitors and staff are critical for museums. Empowerment equals representation, seeing your story, your relevant story in those museums. It means also community participation. So this is a museum I worked on in Patna in Bihar. I don't know if any one of you are familiar with that museum. It's not completely opened yet, and I worked on 2. And this was part of the community engagement process we did for the Science Center. And it's supposed to be for students and children in the Science Center, but no one ever really spoke to children or students about what they wanted to see in the museum. And this young girl, she was about 11, she begged to be included in this session, because mainly we were looking at 16 to 19-year-olds. And she was dynamite. She developed her whole idea of a museum, she came up with the whole idea, and it is something as planners that we integrated into the museum. Because credibility also means that you see your voice being displayed in the museum. But it also means multiple perspectives. If museums rely on trust and credibility, I'm finishing up. Then you need to show multiple perspectives. Museums aren't vehicles of propaganda. Museums are generally arm's length from government. And a single story does not make for a particularly credible experience. And so multiple perspectives are extremely important on this. My last E is on exchange and the importance of exchange. And I think that this is, it's a nice way for me to finish up quickly and to hand over to Deepika, because I think we'll talk a little bit more in this session about the importance of collection exchange, knowledge exchange, and people exchange as being the 4th E in how to activate soft power in the museums of today and in 21st century museums. So thank you.